welcome to the Communication Studies podcast. My name is Justin Young. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Communication Studies at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And today my guest is Dr. Craig Gingrich-Philbrook. Hi, Craig.
Hi, Justin.
So let's go ahead and jump right into it. But one of the things, if this is the first episode you're listening to, one of the things that's a little unique about this podcast is that we're going to try to explain things as we go along. So if you don't have a background necessarily in communication or more specifically performance studies, as Craig does, we're going to try to define a lot of the things that we're talking about so that you won't be completely left out of the process and everything. So just to kick off, Craig, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into communication? Because looking at your CV, I noticed that you started out in creative writing and then transitioned into communication. So what precipitated that shift?
Sure. Well, when I think about how I come to communication, the big part of the story there is that I participated in debate as a young person. In high school and in college. And so communication from that perspective became a big part of my life very quickly. So I was doing creative writing in high school as I was on the debate team. But every weekend going to tournaments and listening to people give persuasive speeches about things that people needed to change, or, in terms of their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, or expository speeches about new technologies and interesting phenomena, performance of literature, people doing performances of prose and poetry that I found really moving. All of that had a big impact on me. And so even though I pursued an undergraduate degree in creative writing, particularly poetry, I always had this sense of poetry participating in the world. And so I was, for example, I was really interested in the poetry of Carolyn Forche, who did a lot of work based upon her travels in El Salvador, right? And a book called The Country Between Us had a big impact on me. And so that sense of being a world citizen in a way with your art was a big part of me. I was traveling in college with my debate coach, Isaac Catt, from tournament to tournament, and we'd be coming home in Northern California, riding up I-5 in the dark, and he would talk with me about communication philosophy, and particularly his work here, because he himself had been did his PhD here at SIU. And I was really intrigued by some of the philosophies that he talked about, psychoanalysis, phenomenology. And so kind of toward the end of my undergraduate work in poetry, I went to Cal State Chico. And it happened that my grandparents also lived in that town. My grandfather passed. I didn't want to leave my grandmother, and Isaac had just started this master's program in information studies and interpersonal communication. And so he offered me he said, if you enroll in this program, you can have a master's assistantship. And it allowed me to stay with my grandmother and have a job. And so she wasn't going to be alone in the first years, after my grandfather's death. And I just really loved the classes that I was taking. As an undergrad, I'd taken a lot of classes with Isaac, and they were very influential upon me. And so then I started to get to meet some of the people here. Dr. Richard Lanigan came out to do a guest talk at Cal State Chico. And so that's how I got to this program, and originally in philosophy of communication. And once I got here, I became friends with a wonderful person in my cohort, Dr. Sharon Bebout Carr now, and she was doing a a show based upon her interviews with coal mining families. She herself grew up in a coal mining family. And through the rehearsal process, I learned that performance was a way of doing phenomenological research in a way that just kind of sitting and thinking about things, wasn't for me. And so that allowed me to then kind of blend my creative writing, some of the work that I had, kind of always done in my life with impromptu speaking and so on in forensics, or speech and debate competitions, and also communication philosophy. And so that's kind of how the sort of long and winding road I came down, through forensics, into creative writing, staying in debate teams, having a very influential coach, coming here to sort of do what he had done, and then discovering performance and kind of coming full circle to the creative arts, essentially.
And then eventually coming full circle, so you get your PhD here and graduate, and then end up back at SIU teaching and back on the same stage. I don't know if is it the same physical stage, or is it?
No, there was a renovation between when I left and when I came back, and so I was kind of coming back to a different space.
Right.
When I finished here, I had the opportunity to go and teach at Hofstra University in Hempstead on Long Island, about a half an hour, 40 minutes from Manhattan by Long Island Railroad. And I taught there for 5 years and helped establish the School of Communication there. Mm-hmm. And also began to do some performance art in the city. And then the job came up here. And so in making the decision to apply and to try to come back, and then eventually, having gotten the job to come back, I really felt like I was coming back to a place that had meant a lot to me, where I had really discovered what I wanted to do, that allowed for a kind of deep experimentation in our performance space. And having access to that, being able to have conversations with graduate students about performance was just very appealing to me.
All right. And so part of what you came back and teach now is performance studies. And so in our last episode, Shelby Swafford gave us her definition of performance studies and noted that I would probably get 100 different definitions if I asked 100 different people. So maybe if you could give us your quick, 30-second elevator pitch of what performance studies is. I know that's extremely limiting.
I think, yes and no, we should all be able to do that. Performance studies views performance as a particular mode of communication. And so we look at performance itself as an aesthetic artifact. We use performance as a metaphor for analyzing other things in everyday life. So how is it, for example, that walking through an airport is a performance, or going through a photo album and telling stories to family? How is that a performance? Right. And we also look at performance itself as a mode of research. And so really coming out of the work of Ron Pelias and James Van Oosting, the idea that performance is a way of knowing. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, to go back to the performance experience that I had with the coal mining families, to perform the stories of people isn't necessarily to have complete access to their experience. Nobody would make that argument.
Sure.
But there's a glimpse. It's useful. And through the work of performance, we can learn more about the ways of speaking in a community, or if we're doing performance of literature, to try to get into the voice of the speaker is a way of understanding how that literature is constructed, some of its particular qualities, its special aesthetic features. Mm-hmm. So if we're having to, for example, really work with the rhythm in a poem, right, to perform it is a way to understand that differently than simply reading silently in a chair. If we're working with a poem that has a long set of metaphors and a kind of a rich metaphoric pattern, having to try to live in the decisions of that speaker to use those metaphors can help us understand what they're going through, what the experience of putting that language together that way is like.
So do you view performance as a way of learning empathy for the subjects that you're performing?
Absolutely. And I think we always, whenever we're talking about empathy, we want to be careful and say that there's a difference between empathy and some kind of whole transfer of experience, right? Because lots of folks will sort of doubt the efficacy of empathy, right? Well, just because you have this experience, that doesn't mean that you know me. And I don't think people would make the argument that there's that kind of full transfer of knowledge,
Sure.
like a Vulcan mind meld or something like that happens,
Right.
But that it is one component of developing an empathic response to the world that can lead to coalition and always requires us to remain good listeners. Right? Just the fact that we performed something doesn't mean suddenly we're the expert.
So one of the areas that you focus on is queer performance. And could you explain to us a little about specifically what that entails and maybe even define for us, what specifically you mean by queer in that name?
There are certainly people who, when they hear that phrase, still flinch a little bit. And, we can talk about that. One of the ways that kind of the idea of queer performance starts is really with the development of queer theory, and in a particular historic moment, a kind of turn from an understanding of looking at the lives of LGBTQ people from a kind of gay and lesbian studies perspective, right? That really kind of tended to emphasize a certain, so the argument goes, right? A kind of static gay or lesbian identity. Certainly with historical changes and things like that over time, but slowly. And so as groups like Queer Nation are responding to the AIDS crisis, there's a seizure of that word queer, a refunctioning of that word queer.
So this would have been in the 1980s?
Yeah, late 80s and early 90s.
Okay.
And so people, including myself, started using that word instead of gay, or perhaps instead of lesbian, or perhaps instead of bisexual, and some people didn't make that switch, right? Because that's a word that a lot of people have hurled at them on playgrounds as a slur. And when I say that it's still a word that makes some people flinch, I mean that with empathy. There are folks who will never accept that word to talk about themselves.
I mean, it was definitely a pejorative when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And, there's an age difference between the two of us, and it was still a pejorative at that point, which is why, I'm one of those people who kind of flinches, I would still rather use gay and lesbian than that term simply for that reason, right?
And so one of the reasons that folks wanted to take that word back is to ask folks to say or to think or to see that the difference that kind of marked the ability to have same-sex attraction and relationships and all of that wasn't queer in that way that the pejorative meant it, right? Or at the very least, if it was, that it had value, right? That it wasn't just an aberration, right? That there were contributions to be made in and through that difference, right, to the range of human experience, right? And so it kind of comes about as folks are starting to ask questions about kind of the quote-unquote gay movement, which is the degree to which it was seeking merely to assimilate and to be, sort of exactly like so-called straight culture. Right? There are also people who then use that word to kind of rethink some aspects of straight culture and ask, well, certainly not every heterosexual couple or every heterosexual person is completely normative, right? And sort of lives the kind of the TV 50s sitcom version of heterosexuality, right? There's variation in human relationships. And by that, we don't just mean sexual activity or practices. Also about distribution of labor, how the kind of the gender performance expectations in a relationship. Right?
So we're talking about who cooks dinner, who might work on the car, that sort of labor split.
Yeah, certainly we can use those as examples of some of that, of some of those differences. So,
who takes care of the kids.
Yeah, and that there had always been that variation, but that even in those kind of so-called straight relationships, there was punishment by neighbors or family if there was a sense of, that there was a variance from the norm. And by punishment here, I can just mean that there was intrusion, or, hey, it shouldn't be that way, or, weird jokes, or, who wears the pants, or, all of that.
So we can talk about a very modern trend that we see with women out earning their husbands in a lot of relationships today, and that there's still a stigma attached for a lot of people in that idea.
Yeah, and from my perspective, queer theory would be interested in dissolving that stigma, right? And I think because of its association with feminism, right, among other things. Now, that sort of non-normative edge, in queer theory, is celebrated sometimes as a generator of difference and possibility, right? So think about the explosion of terms for gender identity that we're living through right now, which some people experience as beautiful and wonderful, liberating, empowering, and other people can kind of feel bewildered by. I was really moved in this kind of transition period by the work of the philosopher Judith Butler, who used to talk a lot about proliferation. And the idea here is that we would not just try to have like two identities, but many identities, and think about all kinds of different ways of organizing our lives and our relationships. And to me, what we're living through right now is an example of that, is sort of that strategy paying off in some really beautiful ways that help people kind of cohere around a name, however temporarily, because the vocabulary is always changing and evolving, as a way of clarifying their intentions about how to live, about how to experience their gender, about who they are, who they want to be. And in so doing, then, however, this may sound, to some people, come closer to exercising freedom.
So how does that translate onto the stage?
When we talk about queer performance, then we're talking about stories, we can kind of think about it from the content level first. So often, the stories of LGBTQ folks, at least historically, were tragic ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those were the stories that we saw in movies, right?
And that was probably also a lot of what we were getting in gay and lesbian studies and that sort of thing. Often was the persecution.
Yeah, it could be. Certainly, that was one facet of that, right? Whereas, as we turn to queer performance, certainly we're talking more about fighting back politically, talking more about pleasure, insisting more upon political participation, and not just sort of telling the older stories. And so there are folks like my beloved friend Tim Miller, who in his work, really talking about pleasure, talking about relationships that sort of aren't always about kind of growing up in tragic circumstances, really start to change the ways that queer performance art is happening. And then, along come folks like Ron Athey, who are working, really pushing the envelope in relationship to body autonomy. And so at that kind of content level, we're getting new stories on stage. And so queer performance names that content. We could also think about it more from the standpoint of what folks are doing on stage, and think about the kinds of work that people do, the kinds of strategies that folks are using in their performances that might be kind of going against the grain of the normative, whether that's at the level of the kinds of things that they're showing, the use of the body, and also I guess certainly at some level I associate queer performance, by no means exclusively, but being more open to expressions of rage and anger on stage about the state of the world. And as it has continued to develop, there are increasing coalitions with ecological performance because of identifications around the questions of, well, having sort of lived through persecution, having lived through an era where it felt like there were populations that were kind of trying to wipe us off the map, right? And I'm talking here about the AIDS era. What does that teach us about watching extinction, right, happen? With plant and animal species. What does that teach us about our obligation to work coalitionally with other people who we've seen dominant culture try to, again, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally, wipe off the map? And so what starts to happen as the idea of intersectionality starts moving into queer performance, and there's a reflection on the degree to which a lot of the sort of big names, as it were, are often white and European, is just this, again, a kind of proliferation of attention to performers who are people of color, are disabled people of color, and et cetera, this kind of multiplication of identities. So, I think about Jesus Valles as an extraordinary example of someone working at the intersection of queer performance and immigration. And we were fortunate enough to have him come to do a performance here a number of years ago.
And when you use that term intersectionality, you mean where different identities are overlapping and crossing with one another?
Yes, and not just the phenomenon of that overlap, but the genuine understanding that with those differences come disequilibrium in privilege, right? That and different limitations on access that need to be overcome. And often a kind of, there is, I think, a critical, perhaps reparative impulse in a lot of that to really look reflexively at even what we might kind of think of as dominant queer culture, and ask questions about whether we're really living up to the kind of openness and the kind of coalition that we claim we are, right? And so that when we kind of try to think intersectionally, it isn't just, I happen to notice, that this performer has this demographic location and that performer has, another demographic identity. I try to think about what that means for them in relationship to how their experience is different, and to try to then avoid standing up on stage and saying something like, as queer people, well,
right,
we're not all the same, right? And to try to acknowledge latitude in a different way, in a more nuanced way.
One of the things you said that I didn't want to interrupt you at the time, but you talked about rage, right? And you talked about how that maybe brings you together with other groups, and those who are concerned with the environment. I would assume feminist and other groups. So that's to me is interesting as this idea of rage, and I think most people can imagine where a lot of that rage is coming from, what is causing it, but maybe we don't actually know where all that rage is coming from. Thinking of that, do you see that as something that's changing? Is it shifting as gay and lesbian or queer culture has shifted over the decades? Is some of that changing, and is that changing those relationships between those different groups? In other words, I guess maybe is the queer culture as angry as it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Is it more angry? And is the environmental culture as angry or more angry today? And does that change your relationships with one another?
Well, it's an interesting question, in some ways, because I don't necessarily have, an instrument that would, give me a quantitative rating, kind of on the rage level, so to speak.
Sure.
And I also, I want to be careful because it's by no means exclusively, kind of a question of rage.
Right.
One of the things that I talk about in my queer theory classes is to be careful about a kind of teleological thinking, right? Or a sense of that progress is irreversible.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I mean by that is, I don't know that we're, on like an escalator to the happy place.
Right.
And every day we get closer and closer, right? Because the world changes and the conditions change, and some of that's, kind of pretty unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if there's a way I would answer the question, it's that I'll try to speak for myself here,
Mm-hmm.
right? When I think about what terrified me about growing up in the AIDS era, what crushed me
Mm-hmm.
was the profound awareness that there were people for whom I was disposable, and my friends were disposable,
Mm-hmm.
and that made me angry because I believed that I and they had value. Well, if I become aware as a young person of that phenomenon, of what it means to decide that people are disposable, well, then I need to look around me, and I need to see who else is being considered disposable,
Mm-hmm.
And to try to do something about that as well, and to think more about that condition of disposability and how it is imposed upon people and phenomena. So if I think about that from the ecological perspective, certainly there are still a lot of things that are considered disposable, right? We're watching a profound amount of destruction in the Amazon right now because politicians think that it's disposable, and we're seeing all kinds of issues. One that's particularly important to me, the question of palm oil. So palm oil plantations displace rainforest habitat,
Mm-hmm.
and are propelling extinction particularly for orangutans, but other species that live alongside them, because they're considered disposable, and we want our cheap snacks,
Mm-hmm.
right, as a culture. And if I can identify with that sense that something is considered disposable, I want to try to, I'm as interested in helping those species as I am LGBTQ folks. And there are some people, who don't necessarily take that leap. But
Right.
for me, queer theory and queer performance demands that I take that leap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really try to think more about the web of it, right?
All right. One of the other areas that you specialize in or have interest in is performance and mediated environments, which I thought sounded really interesting because I'm trying, I don't know what that is, and I'm trying to picture in my head exactly what that means. I have some ideas, but I'll let you explain it.
Okay. Well, I think, this is I'm just trying to find in using that term, for a class, sort of back in the day, we changed it to performance and technology, or performance and media now. But as media changed, and I think particularly through performance art and multimedia theater, phrases that might be more familiar to people, the question of, well, what does it mean to be on stage with a video, right? Or to have a big video backdrop behind you, or to create a situation in which, through technology where we have clothing that we can play because of electronics wired within it, right? Or we can set up a stage in such a way that if I move over here, a particular note plays or a particular video plays or something like that. How does that change the way that we understand storytelling?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so what are the different ways that I can, if I go ahead and use that technology, how does that change the kinds of meaning that I can make on stage? So just kind of as an example, I can have a video behind me that substitutes for a scene, right? Maybe I have a forest behind me and I happen to be in a forest in the show, or maybe the video supplies a dream image, or maybe the video is speaking to me as a kind of another aspect of myself. I can use that technology to kind of think about different ways of telling the story and different content, right, that I can deliver to the audience besides just kind of using my voice or movement. Sound can be the sound of the environment that I happen to be in. It can be my inner thoughts, right? So I can use that technology to, what I want to say here, the phrase that's coming to my mind is to multiply the picture plane. So what is that? If you think about what cubism does to realism, right? It kind of puts us in different places and different perspectives around whatever is being depicted, right? Well, when I think about performing in a mediated environment, I can bring so much sort of more into that space, different facets of an experience. And so I'm speaking very phenomenologically here in relationship to kind of what it means, how it changes the way that an audience might understand the relationship between the performer and his or her, their consciousness that they're trying to share with the audience. Right?
Do you feel like, so part of going to a theater and going to a performance, right, is that experience of being somewhere live, not only with the live performers, but also with the live audience around you. And it's a unique experience, I believe, that you can't recapture. You can't, streaming Hamilton at home on Disney Plus doesn't recapture that same experience. It may be enjoyable, but it's not the same experience as seeing it live in a theater with other audience members and the live cast and all that. Is there a worry at some point that as you add media to the stagescape, that you are removing some of that, or maybe distancing the performer and the audience in some way? And, again, I'm asking, this is not my specialty, so I'm asking completely blindly here if that is an issue.
Yeah, this is a really good question, because it is, Justin, this is a very fundamental aesthetic question, right? So, if we think about some of the movements in art associated with modernism, right? Particularly in painting, we have folks like the critic Clement Greenberg, who say that, what you want to do is take everything out of painting that isn't painting, right? So narrative doesn't belong in painting, that's storytelling, right? For him. And so that's a move to sort of purify an art form to its essence, right? And so the question that you ask, reminds me that there are a lot of people, including myself, who love to watch just a person on a stage telling a story, moving, being there with the audience in that live interaction, wherein the relationship between that performer and the audience is the medium. Right? That's the thing. If I'm blowing glass is the medium. If I'm there in that situation with that performer alone on a stage, with the audience, the relationship is the medium. That's what's being changed, shaped by the things that the performer is doing, and the ways that the audience is responding. And that is beautiful, and it has its place. And I certainly work in that way a lot. I'm also really interested in, a kind of, what we might think of as a more postmodern approach, whereby we're not interested in maintaining, this sort of essential aspect of performance in relationship to that, storyteller on stage. And we're completely welcome to bring in fashion and think about, wild costumes, and to bring in music and composers and move into a way of making art, on stage, making performance that is saturated with any number of approaches and any number of things. And I like to work that way too. Right. I like to project things all over the stage or create strange apparatuses, that, that do something unusual on stage. I was really influenced by Survival Research Laboratories, which was this group, that created these, gigantic, machines that, often had parts of animal remains on them, and then they would sort of set them, loose in a giant stadium to destroy each other, right? Kind of like battle bots right before that, that happened, which I think was kind of interesting and derivative, on Survival Research Laboratories in a way. So what I try to do, I think, as an instructor, is to help students appreciate, this continuum of performance, right? That might move from that very beautiful encounter, between a person on a stage and an audience, and, any number of other kinds of things that would be different ways of telling a story. Or of, this phrase that I use of making meaning on stage or revealing meaning on stage. So there are people who are who become afraid of, that performance loses what makes it distinct the more that it moves into, some of this other territory. There's a big question, if something is only a video, is it a performance, right? That a lot of people, might ask. And it's something that the Performance Studies Division of the National Communication Association is kind of taking up. We can certainly talk about the performance in the video, but, in a way that we might talk about, acting on film. Right? Does performance have to have this sort of live component? And a lot of us had our presuppositions about that tested, recently in the COVID era, when a lot of performance spaces and a lot of our programs had to make the decision. If I want to continue to make work and I can't have audiences safely, how do I get the performance to them?
Right.
And I think that the viability of watching live performance on Zoom or something like that kind of created a whole bunch of other opportunities for people, and who may not have thought that was performance, right? Who may have said,
right.
no, I want to be on stage, kind of with an audience. and helped them, as performance study said, use performance as a way of knowing. Go through that experience rather than keeping it away from themselves, rather than saying, no, I will never do that. I need to be on stage. It's not performance, right? And see that there's still something happening. There's still an aesthetic transaction that's happening, between performers and audiences in that capacity. It changed a lot of people's minds, right? And that's why I like to, help students have a bunch of different performance experiences so that they can sort of pick and choose in a way. When they have a particular meaning that they want to share, what would be the best way to do that?
Right.
And to be able to ask and answer that question in some detail with some experience behind them, rather than sort of defaulting to that generic expectation. No, it must be just a person on stage.
Well, I feel like we could have the entire rest of the podcast discussing just that one topic, but I do want to move on just because we do have kind of a timely topic. You're teaching a course in compassionate communication.
Yes.
Could you kind of let us know what that course entails and everything? Because again, just knee jerk, I think a lot of people would go, okay, well, is that just choosing our words more carefully? Like, what do we mean by compassionate communication?
Sure. This perspective on communication really comes out of a particular approach to interpersonal communication that asks us to think about our relationships not as simply instrumental, right? Which is to say, I'm not in this relationship just to have a relationship, or, kind of to live through the relationship in a, just kind of going about our business, not sharing our feelings, that kind of thing. It's parallel and interpersonal, I think, to a move in rhetoric that might actually help me make the distinction, about what compassionate communication is. So, when Sally Miller Gerhardt and others moved to the idea that the dominant way we talk about persuasion is that I'm some kind of specialist who's going to change your mind, right? And that's really seen as sort of intrusive and dominating, kind of in that view. And so they make a turn toward invitational rhetoric. What can I do to, in my speech, in my attempt to persuade you, to invite you to look at something a different way, rather than trying to make you look at something a different way. Right? And so in compassionate communication, and kind of particularly in kind of thinking about nonviolent communication, what we're doing in our individual interactions, for the most part, although there are more institutional ways of thinking about this, like in kind of moving compassionate communication into a high school or a prison or a negotiation or something like that. But for the most part, in an interpersonal, how can I interact with you in such a way that I'm not trying to just get you to do what I want, right? Where it's not about finding fault and blame, where I can try to describe what I'm experiencing in a non-judgmental way, tell you what I need, to feel secure, to feel good about myself, to feel confirmed, without shaming you into doing something that I want you to do. Right? And that can be as simple as how we divide the labor in the relationship, or it can be larger. And so the class is really about trying to, hey, let's slow down in a conflict situation and try to ask, well, what's really going on here? I think we've all had the experience of being in a conflict in a relationship and realizing what we're arguing about here is really not the center of the conflict.
Sure.
Right. I've got something that's driving me into this conflict, and you've got something that's driving you into this conflict, and they may not be the same at all. And if we're not willing to explore sort of what's bringing us into this conflict, non-judgmentally. That is, I don't think it's your fault, and you don't think it's my fault. And we ask ourselves, well, what really is going on here? Then we're going to have a better outcome, not just in relationship to, whatever it is we seem to be arguing about, but the nature of our relationship can be transformed, right? Can be made better. And so compassionate communication is really a way of looking at a variety of ways of getting to that point. Right? The kinds of communication that we might want to avoid, the kinds of communication we might want to do more of, and also, some techniques for when we don't know what to do, right? And we're scared.
So the reason I really wanted to get into talking about that class was because of an experience that you had very recently filming a reality television show.
Yes.
Called Relative Race, and it's produced by BYU TV, or airs on BYU TV. So if you're interested, you can Google that and find their website, and the episodes are streaming. We should note that at the time we're recording this, only 2 episodes of the season you're affiliated with are currently available. So we can't talk about anything past those, assuming anything past those involves you in any way. And I don't know that, you can't talk about that, so we should clarify that up front and everything. But maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that show, like how you got involved with it and everything, and maybe tell us a little bit about your experience with that show.
Sure. Relative Race, I find it to be a very moving show. And I didn't know of it until I was contacted by them. So I'll tell you a little bit about the show and then kind of how I got involved.
Okay.
So it's a competition reality show. And so what happens is that usually it's people who are adopted, but sometimes there are other circumstances. Audition to be on the show, and they have someone with them typically. Now that may be a sibling who's also adopted. That may be their life partner. There have been, kind of some other relationships. But essentially what happens is the show does research through Ancestry.com and finds relatives for these people, again, sort of typically adoptees, who are willing to meet them, right? And that is in itself a kind of harrowing experience. And there's an extraordinary person who works with the show named Tristan, who's the head genealogist, who works so hard for these adoptees to locate relatives for them. And what happens then is that they discern, well, of all of the people that we're working with kind of in this audition process, these are the 4 teams of 2 that we can find the most relatives who are willing to meet them. They get cast. And so then what happens is they go, there's this 10-day journey that they go on. The shows are set up like a lot of competition shows, where there's a kind of challenge in the beginning that has a kind of obstacle course quality. And then they get the city that they're supposed to go to meet their relative. And so they drive in these cars that are equipped with cameras. Occasionally there's flights involved to that location. And then they have to take a picture to prove that they're there. And then they get the address of their relative. So there's this race element. Right?
It's sort of like The Amazing Race.
Yeah. Okay. And so then they get to that place. And to me, that's where the compassion kicks in. Right? So someone is willing to open their home, to a stranger and meet them and sort of connect the dots for adoptees. And as someone who grew up with an adopted sister and kind of watched her go through a lot of pain when she wasn't able to connect with her birth mother, because of the birth mother's choice. And it was very clear to me that I was going to say yes to this, right? And so because they contacted me and said, we believe you are the uncle of a person who is auditioning for our show.
Mm-hmm.
And would you take a DNA test? And I did. And they said, yes, you are in fact this person's uncle. And I discovered that he is the child of a half-sister that I wasn't sure I had. My mother had said something about the possibility to me when I was a child. And I learned that kind of in that moment that half-sister had passed. But I had this opportunity to meet her child, who would be the grandson of my father.
Mm-hmm.
My father passed when I was 12, and the idea that I would be able to lay eyes on a trace of him in this world just made me so happy.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's this period of, waiting to see if other people will say yes,
Right.
And so, this, basically, year of patience, which I was kind of impatient in, to be honest with you.
Did you film the show this past summer?
Yes.
And so did they contact you last summer?
The previous summer, yes.
Okay, summer of 2020.
Yeah.
So it was a full year of waiting.
But a little bit less than a year. But,
Okay.
But essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It felt like more than a year, but it was a little bit less than a year.
Well, there were other reasons the last year has felt more
That's
than a
true.
year as
That's
well.
absolutely true. And so I had the opportunity to meet my nephew Stephen and his extraordinary wife Susan. And I, because the episode is aired, I can say I have to provide him with the news that he won't be able to meet his mother because she's gone.
Mm.
And to live through that moment with someone, have to figure out how to give that news, and then have him, because he is such an extraordinary person, turn around and say, "I'm so sorry you had to give me that news. That must have been hard for you," and want to take care of me too.
Right.
Was just probably one of the most moving experiences of my life. And so many people have commented on that exchange, and the fans of the show, in social media and so on. And so many of my friends and his, said to us respectively, "Oh, I can see your compassion in him."
Mm-hmm.
And so to be watching this show now come out while I'm teaching compassionate communication, and think about what it means to take the risk to tell the story of how we feel, not just to a stranger, sometimes to someone we know. Because when we keep our feelings to ourselves and we don't share our needs with people, we are in a way keeping ourselves a stranger to them, even if we've been married to them for 20 years.
Right.
And so if I think about the class, in relationship to this, it isn't just watching, a particular person meet a family member. What we watch in the show is these, 4 teams of 2 go through this experience. And really the ethos of the show is that we're rooting for everybody.
Right.
To meet as many relatives as they can, to not get those 3 strikes that, are going to kick them off. And really the beauty of the show is that even when that happens, there are these things called golden tickets where they get to meet more relatives. And the show shares the information with them, that for relatives that they may not get to meet if they're, particularly if they're eliminated very early.
Yeah. I mean, watching it myself, one of the things I took away from it was, it's a very positive reality program. Like usually reality program is very negative, or most of the popular shows kind of have that reputation of being kind of almost mean-spirited and encouraging people to, sabotage one another to play the game in a correct way. And this one is a very sort of affirming show. You, like you said, you're rooting for all 4 teams because there's really no prize except that they all find their family. Like, I mean, at least for us as the audience, like we're not rooting necessarily for one team to win a particular prize. And, you know, one of the things I thought really interesting, and I think I had maybe this unique experience watching it because I know you, is that when I was watching the episode, which was the first episode where you meet him and everything, and you're telling him about his family and telling him about his mom and everything, I'm sitting there thinking about how emotional this is for you. I'm not thinking as much about him in that moment. Now, again, that's because I know you, but like, and I think that gave me a unique perspective on it, because then I started thinking, well, no, this is just as emotional for the people who are delivering this news. And particularly in situations like that one where you're having to deliver bad news, and it's bad news about his mom, but also your sister. Yeah. And so, you know, I think it gave me a unique perspective watching it about, you know, because usually we're so kind of focused on the competitors or the protagonists, the characters that have been created for us to kind of root for or root against, that these people who are coming into the show are just as much emotionally invested in what's going on and what's happening. So one of the things I kind of wondered is, you know, I think you do a really great job in that segment of talking to him and like being supportive of him. But that must have been something you had to gear yourself up for, I would think, so that you were prepared for that, so that you could, you know, you could be supportive for him in that moment.
Yeah. I think, you know, I had the advantage of having known that she was gone for, I think, several months at least before I had to break the news to him. And so I remember driving to the location, you know, which was a number of days because I didn't want to drive all day. And really thinking a lot about Charlene, my half-sister, and what I, you know, deprived of the opportunity to know her, that I would at least be able to, you know, meet her child. And I still don't know the circumstances really under which it was necessary for her to place him for adoption when he was 3. I'm hoping, because you know, like you say, I haven't seen future episodes. I'm hoping that I get some answers as I watch him hope to get answers. But to be able to at least sort of for her meet him. You know, there's a lot of, there was definitely a lot of thinking about her that I did in the car, you know, on the way there, gearing myself up, you know, as you say. And yeah, I'm sorry, Justin, you know, I'm kind of sitting here. I mean, you can see me and the audience can't, you know, so you can see this contemplative look on my face as I'm, you know, trying to frame a way of speaking about this. But I think one of the things that really draws me to the show is that I think so many of us have a situation in our lives where a relative has disappeared, where we've lost touch with a beloved cousin just because of how things, you know, move in the world. And there's this desire to reach out before it's too late, right? And so one of the things we learn in that episode is how close Stephen was geographically to where she passed,
right?
You know, and really sort of that lost opportunity. And so, you know, if I talk about this in the compassionate communication class, you know, there's a period of time where my mother and I aren't speaking sort of right before her death, and I call her, you know, because her best friend, you know, a woman that I called Aunt Ginger, you know, passed, and I saw that on social media, so I reached out to her, and you know, we, you know, sort of made up and agreed to talk in a few days, and but she died just a couple days later, after that call. I can't imagine my life without that call, without having had that opportunity to make that up. And sometimes we're not in the position. It isn't safe to try to, contact that person for one reason or another, right?
Right.
I have in my heart a beloved stepsister, and her father was violent toward my mother, and they had to divorce. But Christy was in my life for 5 years, I think, and I just adored her.
Right.
And there's a part of me living through this experience is like, I must find her. Right? I must find her. And for years, I didn't try because I was concerned about her father, being back in contact with my mother. So there are complications in all of our lives, right? We're certainly not blessed all to have that normative life. I don't know that any of us really is, and to go back to queer theory in a way, to think about how we all live these lives of deep and abiding difference from, that kind of happy life that we think we're supposed to live, and all of the shoulds. One of the things in compassionate communication that we try to do is to get rid of the should. Mm-hmm. And not in an ethical sense, like, you should be honest, but that sense of, I should make more money, I should, do all of that. And there's even an expression, don't should yourself, with the kind of pun that's implied there a little bit with the sound that I won't, kind of draw out here. But that, to be able to break through that, fear and meet someone, who's longing to find a relative was just so important to me. And I'm really, really glad I did. And over again, the show, Relative Race, tells us these stories of people reconnecting and finding some peace. It's a very moving experience.
Yeah, one of the other teams, I believe it's the blue team. In that same episode, he meets his brother, or his half brother. I forget exactly what it is. But they find out that they were both firemen in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Like basically within like the same county, I think.
Trained at the same school.
Yeah. And, so you kind of talking about like just how close, like they could be and everything. And, I think that's one of the, I don't think the show is going out of its way to make that point, but I think it is one of the points that comes out of the show, sort of organically and everything, is how close a lot of these people in our lives are physically in some cases. And in the case of Stephen, how close time-wise, So really interesting show. It's a bit of The Amazing Race, a bit of I can't think of the name of it offhand right now. The PBS show, like right. Find Your Roots, or I forget the exact name of it. But it reminded me of both of those, and like a very sort of affirming show in a lot of ways. Easy to watch. Well, we are running out of time here, and so I did want to talk about a couple of things just here real quick. One of our graduate students, T. Brown, is performing a show later this semester, I believe in November. Is that when the show is? Called Naked Stories, which you are co-directing with him. Mm-hmm. So we did want to put in a quick plug for that. And the Klein Now, which you work with and help direct and everything, is going to have several shows over the course of the semester and everything, and the school year. If people want to know more about the Klein Now, what's the easiest way? Just to Google Klein Now, SIU, find the schedule.
Yeah, a Kleinau Theater, SIU will get you. If you Google that, you'll get to the right place. Right. And we can also, put because I don't have the web link memorized, we can put that in to the description of the podcast.
Okay, great. So last question here. So because this podcast is a bit about demystifying communication and, making communication more accessible to a lot of different people. One of the ways that most often happens, most people experience communication, think of communication is, of course, through media. So obviously shows like Relative Race. So one of the questions I like to end with is asking my guests, what is something that you've been watching, reading, playing, or listening to lately that you just really want to talk about or recommend to people?
Reservation Dogs. Just an extraordinary. It's an extraordinary show about young people on a reservation, Native American, indigenous reservation, who are committed to one another. In interpersonal communication, sometimes we talk about such groups as existential ensembles, which is just kind of this big way of saying these are people who are committed to one another and are genuinely part of one another's lives in a way that, existential there in that sense of the kind of that deep connection to what it means to be a human being with freedom and choice and have to live in a world and find a way in a world. An ensemble, like a theater ensemble, right? We're connected to each other. We're working together for one another's safety. And so that's not necessarily a word that, existential ensemble, but it's a way of looking at, that a lot of people would use, but it's a way of looking at how friendship works, how commitment works. It is delightful in its occasional surrealism. It is harrowing in terms of the circumstances that those young folks are dealing with. This first season centers in, to a degree in part around their mourning of a friend who has passed. And I won't do spoilers here, but what you see in that element of the show is the long game of mourning, right? Mm-hmm. That sense that it isn't something, you just kind of have a sad weekend and it's over, right? It makes a real impact on their lives, his absence. And it's political in just sweet and ludic ways. It has a cast of characters who kind of weave through the different stories, and you learn more about them over the course of that first season. It's like nothing I've seen on television, and to kind of go back to that sense of really looking at stories that we don't often get to hear, right? And so it has this beautiful quality of trying to, I think, undo sets of stereotypes and expose people who aren't acquainted with reservation life to what that might be like, but also to Native American aesthetics, right? In relationship to storytelling, in relationship to thinking about ancestors. It's a very compelling show.
Yeah. It airs on FX and Hulu.
Yes.
And I actually listened to an interview with the co-creator of the show. He's Native American and made a really big push that most of the crew, not just the cast that was on screen, but the crew also working on the show would be as well. So that, I think that's part of what you're talking about, how it feels so different because it is people putting this show on who traditionally have not had those opportunities. And it does make it come off as feeling very different than anything else that's currently on television.
Mm-hmm. And this is that sense of empowering, not just in relationship to something like self-esteem, but also really the means of production, right? To to think about creating a cast and a crew and a production team and so on as a way of building access, helping careers get started, and so on, so that we're not in a situation where the industry is for lack of a better phrase full of white people telling stories about others that they'd really in some senses may not have any experience with and arguably have no business telling.
Right. One of the things he noted was his career. He had been chosen for a film workshop, and I can't remember exactly what it was tied to. It might have been tied to Sundance, but that he thought after doing that he was going to go into Hollywood and people would be really interested in him. And he said, he got a lot of doors shut in his face and a lot of people saying, yeah, this is really great, but can we change some of these Indian characters to be, he said, essentially at some situations telling him more marketable, which meant more white in a lot of situations. And he had to go home to, I believe, Oklahoma and basically finance these films through fundraising, and did several films that eventually got him to this point. Mm-hmm. But I mean, he took you talking about non-traditional voices, he really had to work outside the traditional system even to get to this point where now he is on a very traditional cable network and streaming platform and everything, and kind of on his own terms.
And and thank goodness he did. Right, the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera has a quotation that's essentially that the thing that makes my work most Mexican is what makes it most universal, and what that, and I think about that in relationship to this show. Mm-hmm. Where some people might say, oh, well, if it's just all Native American people, is that marketable? Am I going to get something out of it? And I would say yes, absolutely. Because in its specificity, while there are all kinds of things that are different, what I see is the work of being human together, and because I approach it, kind of from that interpersonal communication, I see that how they disclose their feelings to each other or do not, when and how they elect to kind of be more closed, when and how they orient to, if they kind of want to do things together or be apart, right? How they differentiate and bond. And I can watch those communication processes, right? Where, I think one of the things that makes what we study so important is that so often people think about communication just as a tool. Mm-hmm. I use communication in order to get a thing to happen. And really, we are communication. If you think about it, that's what makes us up. That's how our identities form. The things that we hear and see and are said to us, and so our being is constituted through communication, through our interactions with people. And so if I can view communication that way, I can look at how it is I'm impacting other people through word choice, how I talk to them nonverbally, the institutional situation in which we are having these exchanges, and who does or does not have access to that institution. I can think about all of that as being made through communication, through doors opening or doors being closed in people's faces. Mm-hmm. Through, whether that's the knock at the door on relative race and a relative opening the door to a person, or the knock at a door metaphorically, at a film studio to say, hey, I have this story to tell, mm-hmm. right? And so whether we're telling those stories, through media to hundreds of thousands of people, or, to a relative that we've just met, in the last 5 minutes and have to break terrible news to, right? We're constituting one another's world through communication. And we have a responsibility to do so warmly, openly, creatively, aesthetically, ethically. And that's what our discipline looks at. All of those things rolled up together.
All right. I think that's a great note to end on. And I want to thank you, Craig, for taking some time out of your day to sit down and chat with us and everything. If people want to know more about you or would want to get in touch with you to discuss anything, is there a way that you would prefer that? Social media or?
Well, they could email me.
Okay.
It's craiggp@siu.edu.
Okay.
And that's probably the best way, I think. Yeah.
All right. And if you have questions or comments about the podcast, you can always email me at justin.young@siu.edu. Again, Craig, thank you for taking time. Thank you for all of our listeners, and we'll be back next time.